Your voice, your opinion, your community. Fact TV, free speech, protected.
Good afternoon. We're here on a lovely winter Vermont afternoon, close to Christmas, so I would like to extend the compliments of the season to everyone who's viewing our program. This program is going to talk about the Putney General Store, and it's a show that Bob Haas and I always wanted to do together. We've probably been talking about it for a year. And we would have done it together. Unfortunately, Bob passed away on November 3rd, and so I'm carrying on the legacy on my own. The Putney General Store is of particular interest to the Cellar Hole investigators because it's a store that had been used since the late 1700s, and it, through a series of misfortunes, actually became a cellar hole, and then was rebuilt and is a store again today. So this afternoon we're lucky to have Lyssa Papazian and Tom Jamison, two friends of mine who practice in historic preservation and archaeology, and they're going to take us on a tour of this remarkable building that sits at one end of the road to Westminster West. Lyssa and Tom, thank you so much for coming down today and participating in the Cellar Hole Investigator Show. It was nice to get out of Westminster and come to town here in Putney, and really appreciate you taking the time to tell us about this remarkable store and all of the work that has gone into the building, understanding its history and archaeology, and indeed telling us about the way the community came together to bring the store back to life. So Lyssa, I thought maybe you could take some time and give us an understanding of the history of the Putney General Store, its role in the town, and you know, what kind of happened to it over time, including the fact that it suffered a couple of very bad fires in recent times.
Sure. So the store was built as a store in around 1796, by 1796. And we know this because some of the Historical Society members did deed research and debunked the theory that it had been built as a grist mill in 1769. Which was out on the internet and never will come back, I think.
There is a mill quite close to here, isn't there? A historic one.
Several mills. So
Yep.
And it makes sense that people might suspect this because we're sitting on the Sackett's Brook, which had 10 mill seats. It's a very dramatic falls right through here. There was a mill across the street, blacksmith shop, and so that gave rise to, I think, the theory. But so it was built as a store in 1796. Pretty traditional. It was one of many stores throughout the town, but the store predated the village here by some, 50 years, because this was a main crossroads of transportation, the north-south, and this was the road that went over across to the county seat in Newfane. So it was a major place for transportation, and also because there was a lot of industrial activity on the mills going on here. Across the street, the tavern was built in 1802, so there was, activity here. The village didn't actually move down here from the hill until the church was built across the street in 1843. So the store was here, and like most general stores in Vermont, it wasn't called the Putney General Store or the Barnard General Store. It was called the Joe Smith's store, whoever owned it. And this store has had dozens of owners over the 200 plus years it's been here, including, for example, Baker and Hewitt, a pair. Often it was a partnership, one who actually ran the store and one who supplied the investment and the money. We have the books here from 1868 and 1867, and just gives a flavor of what kind of trade was going on here. And this was an account book that showed, this gentleman bought, not a cat probably, but 8.5 C's of cat, whatever that was. But he bought a pair of boots, a shirt, a shawl, whereas this guy over here bought some kerosene oil and a book and a bunch of other things, and it's all over the map. Molasses and foodstuffs, codfish, all kinds of things that were traded here. Early on, people would have brought their goods to trade and put on account, and I'm sure the store owner would have gotten things off of the river boats that were coming up from southern New England.
So this really was a general store. There were lots of different commodities here that were
Absolutely.
available to...
And as I've come to understand from the 20th century history and understanding the owners then, it was a general store specific to the owner of the time. For example, Robert Fairchild, who was a long-time owner in the 70s through the 90s, he was a tailor originally. So he offered tailoring services up here. A previous owner happened to be into painting and wallpapering, and so that's what they had up here. It really depended on the owner and their interests and their expertise. And of course, during quite a bit of the 19th century, there was also a hay scale that the store owned and controlled, which was set in the middle of the intersection behind me. And so that was another source of income for the store. It was people would come and weigh their wagons, and so that was a.
And so this road alignment here, I think we're facing Kimball Hill Road, which is that correct? Which runs is the road I take back to Westminster West, and out front here we're on. Was this Route 5?
Main Street.
And were these roads? I mean, are these in fact, as Randy Majors and Bob Haas would have called them, are these in fact ancient roads? I mean, these are roads that have had some considerable longevity in this area.
Yes.
Sure. Yeah.
Yes, definitely.
Here on historic maps and pretty much configured the way they were for a couple hundred years more.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and we can tell that because this store was here and that tavern was there.
Right.
And that mill was there. And so that
they're
was
all
the intersection.
That's the intersection. Yeah.
So, in the 20th century, well, actually at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, the owner at the time, Adalbert Corser, was a great photographer, as was his sister, Mary Twain. And the two of them took amazing and copious numbers of glass plate negatives of the village, of people, of the area. And very fortunately, that is the bulk of the collection the Historical Society has today. Those glass plates were literally in the attic of this building, and very fortunately for us, the Fairchild family took them home. So when the fire happened, we didn't lose them all. And so, this store was going, for over 200 years, and in 2008, an electrical fire in the roof of the second floor where we were sitting burned the roof off. And the owner at the time was not able to rebuild, he found. And so, long story short, we ended up as a historical society representing a community nonprofit, came in and bought the building, gave us a good deal. We bought it and raised money to start restoring the building. And then during the course of that process, an arsonist came in and inexplicably burned it to the ground. And then we had the cellar hole literally burn everything out. So hot was the fire that some of the stones crumbled and disintegrated. And we actually have more property when there's a building here than when there was a cellar hole, because the building's actually hiked out over the brook. So that is where Tom came in, because we, part of raising the funds for this restoration and later reconstruction project involved federal funding, and that required an archaeological examination to make sure we weren't destroying anything valuable in the world of archaeology. So during the process of rebuilding the store, reconstructing the store, initially we were restoring a building, and that wasn't much ground disturbance, but when we lost the building and we had literally the cellar hole, our federal sources of funding required us to investigate before we disturbed the soils, investigate for archaeology and make sure we wouldn't disturb anything that was eligible. So, very fortunate for the Historical Society, Tom Jamison is an archaeologist and on our board, so he was able to do these investigations for us.
Yeah, the Historical Society hired the company I worked for to do the investigation. I should say Hartgen Archaeological Associates. And because of the way the preparation of the site was proceeding, we did the field work in two parts. First to look around the foundation on the street fit sides, and then a second episode to look under a concrete slab that was being removed, and as the foundation itself was being removed in preparation for pouring the new concrete foundation. So we did several units, excavation units around the area, and those around the foundation the preservation was not very good. There was over time, over the 200 years or so, there'd been a lot of disturbance from various work done around the building, and also I think some utilities and road work adjacent to the building. Probably the most informative artifacts were found under various concrete supports that had been added later on that we weren't able to excavate, so that they were found when the excavator that was removing the foundation pulled off some concrete supports. But the formal excavations we did do, in particular on the uphill side of the building, encountered quite a lot of disturbance along the brook. I think probably part of that area had been scoured by some flooding and then refilled with sand and gravel.
So Tom, when you were doing the excavations, what sorts of things did you find? Typically when we're working either on historic archaeological sites or pre-contact archaeological sites, there are elements of the site that are not disturbed or contain some kind of utility, preserve information about their use. We call them features, and then of course there are the artifacts themselves. So you've indicated a lot of disturbance, and usually that's not such a good thing for preserving various types of features, which could be anything from pits or privies or whatever. Did you find any features during the excavation? Did you find any intact deposits that date to the time frame that Lyssa laid out earlier?
Well, there's under the concrete slab we found some evidence of stone footings that were probably added later in the history of the building. Initially, I think that part of the building was just a carriage shed.
Horse shed, yeah.
Horse shed. So it probably didn't have any sort of formal floor at that time. But later on, after that was turned into part of the interior space of the building, it seems that they added some flat stone footings that would have supported a wooden floor. So that was probably the most intact feature that we found.
Do you believe the concrete acted to seal in that deposit, protected it?
Yeah.
Let me ask you this. I think this is an interesting question. I haven't really thought about it. But of course, we have the building as it exists today, and of course, all of us were able to traipse through it before the disaster struck with the fires. It was a very interesting sort of labyrinthine building at that point.
It is right before,
Yes.
a couple years before the fires. So it looks a lot like it does today, but not quite.
There you go. Is there kind of a development of this store in a way, archaeologically, and in terms of its structure? My home, up in Westminster started out really as a cabin, and then people started adding things to it. I mean, we did. Either structurally or through the archaeology, do we see an evolution of this building in terms of parts of it being used for different things, or it was building up because it was being more prosperous?
Yeah, I think there are two aspects of that. One is that in the front here, what are those windows called?
The bay windows.
The two bay windows were added in the late 19th century?
Yeah, 1890. Again, the photographer owner also transformed the building from a pretty simple, building to one that was sort of Victorianized with these two-story.
Oh, really?
These, which we tried to recreate the look of, but two-story bay windows with porches in between. So that was really, gussied up the look of the store and spoke to perhaps its prosperity here.
Yeah. So in the excavations, we were able to outline the base of those windows. They were supported with some brick foundation.
They would have come out in, I'm assuming they extended essentially the footprint of the building from what it historically had been.
Yeah. And then on the Brook side, there's evidence of, I think, several episodes of trying to shore up that side of the building from the effects of the brook and flooding.
Well, there's a dam right here.
Right.
So there's a pond. The dam is kind of bisects the building. So the upstream side, there's a pond, and from that pond, there's actually still a pipe supplying water to the mill that goes outside, but it comes like literally through our foundation, and we had to leave it. We couldn't, it was the one piece of the foundation that we had to encase instead of remove because they were still using it for one thing, and we didn't know what would happen if we took it out. So that is just one, and obviously that meant that this property owner had to have a relationship with that property owner and the water rights, who would share them, who would get them. I don't know all of the details. It'd be interesting to research that a little more.
Tom, interesting to hear about the evolution of the building and how it was reflected in your archaeological studies. Maybe you brought some artifacts today, which is great, because they look really interesting even to me, and I'm a prehistorian. So maybe you could talk about some of the artifacts you found during your archaeological work.
Yeah, most of the artifacts that are particularly interesting were collected by the construction supervisor, Scott Shara. He was working with the excavator, the excavator, while the foundation was being removed, and he kept on bringing artifacts over to us while we were working on the formal excavations that weren't really producing much. So one of the largest parts of the collection are these kale and clay pipes that were very typical of 19th century personal use.
So you've got both stem fragments,
Yeah.
and you've also got bowl fragments.
Yeah.
Maybe you could describe some of the, some of them are rather lavishly decorated, make them very interesting.
Yeah, there are a number that are represent heads of somebody. they often appear sort of to have a headdress of some sort, and they have some variations. Others.
This one almost looks like a classical figure of some sort.
Yeah, it's interesting. Others have smaller figures molded into them that it's hard to really determine what this one in particular represents. And some are more plain with very basic decoration. And the pipe stems of these pipes often have the maker's mark stamped into them.
So what do we know about these pipes? I mean, what's their origin, and do you have a sense of their age?
Most of them were made in Montreal or Glasgow, Scotland. And they generally date to the mid to late 19th century. One unusual fragment is this bowl. It has a depiction of an early locomotive on it. And I didn't look up the date for that.
The locomotive is depicted, reminded me of George Stephenson's rocket, which was an early locomotive. That what little is preserved on the bowl is very reminiscent.
And one of the things we noted about the pipes is that they don't appear to be used. So that suggests to me that they're part of the stock of the store that was either broken at some point and just tossed out the back of the building, or just somehow ended up in the fill along the brook.
Just out of interest, with tobacco pipes of that sort, I mean, do either of you have any sense of the longevity of someone using a pipe like that? I've heard all sorts of interesting tale that they would break pieces off and and
it looks really temporary.
Yeah, they do. They I mean, certainly if they hit the floor, that would be that'd be the end of them.
Yeah, sometimes you find pipe stems that are quite worn from being chewed on, but
not unlike today.
Yeah, but I think frequently they were pretty disposable.
Pretty expendable. Interesting.
And in the ledger, I looked through and noted some prices for pipes. One case in 1875, they sold one pipe for 50 cents, but then elsewhere in the same year, one was sold for 30 cents, and a month later, two pipes were sold for 2 cents. So I don't know if maybe the 2 cents ones were ones they wanted to get rid of, or what the story was. But
50 cents or 30 cents, that would have been fairly dear, wouldn't it?
I would think so. Yeah.
So speaking of sort of luxury items, and again, I'm not an expert here, but you can certainly inform me. You have some very interesting decorated ceramics, which I believe you can also, even to my untrained eye, you can probably provide some dates that coincide well with this with the store. So maybe you could talk about some of these wares you have.
Yeah, I was surprised how few ceramics and glass artifacts we got. Generally, they seem to date to the late 19th century. These decorated with the banding and the various colors. It's called mocha ware, and that was generally dates to the late 19th century. Others, this sponge decorated ceramic is also that same time period. And this whiteware with this blue
shell edge or something.
Shell edge, feather edge, whatever, is generally the same era. So the small fragments that we got, I don't think indicate a stock necessarily, but could have. It's again, we don't have a great context for finding this material.
What about the aqua glass bottle top out there?
That's probably part of a pharmaceutical bottle.
And of course, there was a pharmacy here in recent times.
In recent times.
Up here, right on this floor.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for 3 years.
Yeah, great
recently.
pharmacy. Yeah.
Well, actually, one of the other things that the Fairchild family mercifully took away from the building and kept at home and then later donated to us was a collection of things that were literally found in the building, in the attic, and some of those were medicinal cabinets with both, human kind of snake oil type medicines and then a whole veterinary cabinet, which are great, and some of them still have stuff in them, which is pretty fun. So I do think that all of that stuff was things that were sold here. I'm really curious about these, and I'm wondering if you have any of these theories about, what they're.
Was that a soapstone?
Yeah, this is part of a soapstone water pipe. A number of fragments like this were found. I think when the initial work in the cellar, while the building was still standing, was happening. I think they're probably mid to late 19th century, and this one is unusual because it has the lead connector intact here.
So that was something that actually was how you joined the two together?
Yeah, lead.
and of course, soapstone occurs in the area. I remember taking a trip with Bob Haas to the Athens Dome to see the quarries and workshops that are still extant up there. It was quite a ride. We were literally driving with the Jeep over boulders on our way up to the top there. I think it's on Pinnacle Land, if I'm not mistaken, isn't it?
There's also one in Grafton, which I guess is right next door.
Right.
And those seem like the most likely candidates for the source of this.
Local origin as opposed to pipes coming in from Scotland or Montreal.
Yeah.
So one question, well, actually, maybe you could speak a little bit about this. That's sort of very interesting, really.
This is a tiny sole of a tiny shoe. And it may be from a child's shoe or from a doll's shoe, possibly.
That would have been a big doll.
Yeah, well, it's hard to say. But yeah, it's an unusual piece of leather preserved in the excavations.
We actually have in our collection many pictures of children from the 1890s standing in front of the store, probably wearing shoes.
They're like little boot affairs, right? Yeah. So one thing that interests me here, looking at this collection with you, Tom, is and your analysis of the age of these artifacts. They generally speak to a little bit later period of time relative to the store's history. Did you find anything earlier? And if you didn't, what might we attribute that to? Why didn't we find anything earlier?
Yeah, I don't think we found anything that we can really date to the first half of the 19th century or earlier. And I would guess that must have something to do with just the amount of reworking around the building that took place.
So it's not necessarily that evidence was never there, it just was displaced?
Well, and the other piece of it is literally we don't have any property beyond the building. As I said, we have more property now that there's a building here than we did with the cellar hole, so there was no like perimeter. There's no like out the back door kind of where you might find, you know, a garbage bin and the area that, you know, it connects literally to the buildings next door who are still there. So there's no outside to
if you want to do some excavations in the brook behind the dam,
Yeah.
there might be something interesting there.
Right.
yeah,
right.
they might.
So one of the things I just want to draw attention to here, you know, we've been talking about scientific archaeological work and historical investigations associated with the cellar hole, albeit it was not a cellar hole until the building burned down and then was burned by an arsonist and it became a cellar hole. You know, one of the things that Bob and I always emphasized in treating these kinds of historic archaeological sites is that they're best left to themselves. In other words, we never undertook or advocated the idea that cellar holes should be poked around in a non-professional way to collect artifacts or whatever. So, you know, one of the things I think that's really important with this particular case, you know, the cellar hole investigators, is that we have controlled scientific excavation tied into good historic research to paint a picture of a building that frankly has been an important part of this community since the late 1700s. And that to me is really it's really remarkable what you've done here and how much care and attention that you've given to the store, even in its most adverse days. So it's been a very interesting conversation today. I thought maybe we could close with your thoughts, both of you, on the value of the work that you've done as it relates to this community, to Putney.
This is a remarkable project that really involved the whole community in a way that was very touching and moving here, and the community really came together around this project, both initially and even after the second fire, even more vigorously, because it kind of riled everyone up. But there were hundreds of individual donors that contributed both money and the beams that we see here were donated by people. They let people, volunteer sawyers, cut trees off their land. This was a a donated frame, timber frame. The raising of the frame involved many local contractors who came and just gave their time, and that's been the story ever since late 2008. And the goal here is to make sure we always have a store at the center of town, because it really does drive the little village that we have. It's the reason why people get out of their cars and actually interact with one another. It's an important gathering place, and we've certainly learned that. And I most recently learned it even more acutely by running the place myself with Betsy McIsaac. The two of us, had to volunteer to step in when we lost our second tenant proprietor here. So we got a really first-hand look at how important this store was to the community. So the Historical Society continues to own the building, and we found a new proprietor who has just started and has wonderfully added a gift shop upstairs, which is terrific. And we wish them a long and happy and prosperous run of it. And we want to, one way that the we're going to try to help that. We have a residual mortgage, small mortgage on the large expense of building the store. We ended up with a small mortgage, and we are now trying to pay it down as much as we can by encouraging donations to the tax-deductible donations to the Historical Society, P.O. Box 260, Putney, Vermont, to help pay down that mortgage. We could, if we can actually get rid of the $180,000 mortgage, we could save $80,000 of that is in actual interest. So
Really a remarkable achievement.
it's been amazing, and we certainly appreciate and thank this community every day for their support by patronizing the store and by helping us build it.
Lyssa and Tom, thank you so much for coming down today and participating in the Cellar Hole Investigator Show. It was nice to get out of Westminster and come to town here in Putney, and really appreciate you taking the time to tell us about this remarkable store and all of the work that has gone into the building, understanding its history and archaeology, and indeed telling us about the way the community came together to bring the store back to life.
I'm going down to the general store, cowboy boy right next door. Can I dance to the local band? Raise a glass to this mountain land. Raise a glass to this mountain land. I'm going down to the general store, cowboy boy right next door. Can I dance to the local band? Raise a glass to this mountain land. Raise a glass to this mountain land. Raise a glass to this mountain land.